by Sir Conan Doyle. That is, when you have eliminated the impossible, whatever remains, however improbable, must be truth. Do you understand what he's saying there? When you factor in everything else, if it quacks like a duck, and it waddles like a duck, it swims like a duck, and it flies like a duck, what's the most likely thing it actually is? A duck. Just because ducks don't live in that pond, you don't eliminate the obvious. And that's what we tend to do with a lot of this anomalous stuff, whether it be ancient history, treasure, cryptid animals, off-world beings, ultra-terrestrials, whatever it may be. The moment it doesn't fit the narrative, it's tossed. Science does not use scientific process. Scientific process doesn't contain bias. It doesn't contain I think. It doesn't even contain I know. It contains here's what we found, and here's what we found about it when we picked it up, when we measured it, when we heated it. This is all we know. This is not done in ancient history, in the world of treasure, in the world of off-worlders, or in the world of our cryptids. People need to ask that why. So part one is ecology. We're going to start with diet and acquisition. So one of the things you notice is a lot of the biologists run around and say, what do they eat? You have a massive animal. And I'm going to tell you right now, a large male, this is the honest truth, will go every bit of 3,200 to 3,300 pounds. This is something that biology doesn't explain, is where does all their food come from? Yet, you take those biologists out in the field, they don't know what to eat. Now you take a traditional Native American out in the field on their home turf, they'll show you what to eat. The biologist has no clue all the stuff you can eat. They don't realize what a hominid or a hominin will consume when it's hungry. In this case, algae and greens through the wintertime, and year-round even. And we find this. Sometimes it's just when there's no other food, algae and sand will work. Because it does have that beneficial protein, it has citric acid, it has a lot of things in it that we take for granted. Another thing, like you'll find in these river basins here, is Russian olive fruit. Now this is a subsistence food. Anywhere you have Russian olive, you have the potential of having Bigfoot activity. And not only that, but you have the potential of having family groups or younger individuals. Not these transient subjects that most people encounter are just going from A to B or on hunting and things like that. And with a range of 100 miles every 24 hours, if they want to move, the big ones, then that's what I mean. People are going to see it and go, oh man, and then we saw a sighting, we've never had another one. Yeah, well, you wouldn't believe the amount of terrain they cover. Look how much terrain a bear will cover when it's looking for territory. 100 miles is nothing. Pinyon pine nut. Regionally, this is another subsistence food source. So when you have Russian olive in the bottomlands, you also often in those type of climates have pinyon or other type of edible pine nuts at their higher elevations. Juniper berries. This is one that most people wouldn't think about. You think of gin and things like that produced by these, but they're very astringent. But they will consume them at certain times of year. Yucca stem and base root. Okay, so this is another thing that we take for granted. You look at, there's millions of yucca throughout in Spanish Bay and other plants like that, all types of altitudes through the southwest USA and the western region. So the base of these are completely edible and they contain moisture. And I use them at times when you go to pretty extreme stuff. We're not carrying enough supplies or whatever. You see when you grab it and bite the bottom. And what you'll see here actually in the right-hand photo, if you can see that, you're going to see the teeth marks of a large hominid. And with the teeth being about the same size as my thumbnail, about twice the size of the average grown male adult. Birds. Birds are another subsistence food. They get them easy. If you would know where a bird roosts, you can walk up and grab it in the dark. Most of it's like chickens. They go docile. You can't see. They'll flop around if you flush them, but they're very easily prey upon. So it just takes paying attention. And one of the favorite ones we've seen are woodpeckers. And why? Once a woodpecker roosts, they're yours. If you can pop them out of that tree, they're yours. And we see where the Bigfoots have actually stuck a finger or two in the woodpecker hole and just busted the side of the tree out to get the bird. But it seems effortless for them. This is one that people don't expect. When hard times are hard times, it's the way it is. And the picture on the right, even though you probably can't see it, and we will throw this up on YouTube and stuff, and we'll toss these frames in so people can go back and see this stuff. But the frame on the right is scat, Bigfoot scat, with porcupine quills and skin in it, swallowed whole. This would cause extreme duress to just about any species I can think of. And they will do stuff like this. Now, deer, that's something we all assume that they prey on. That's an animal that, of course, you'd think. And they have no problem getting them. Often in places where the Bigfoots are prevalent, where they are a lot, the deer won't fear humans. This is an odd thing. You think, wow, I'd be 3 times as scared of a human being. But you gotta figure, Bigfoot use stealth. When they hunt, they do so in a manner that no one ever sees them or hears them, deer included. They take deer from a herd of deer without alerting the other deer. Now, a lot of native tribes do that too, because what are you going to do? You're going to go running your game off. It's not like hunting season like we have, where you go out periodically and shoot one. You don't really care what happens after that in a sense. But if you're living on that herd, in most native regions with most populations, they're very close to that herd. They don't run that herd off. They try to keep and maintain them as best they can and not alert them to slaughter. Livestock. Livestock is another one that's very important. They are opportunistic feeders. They're not all the same. Even though you could describe them as a people having somewhat of a culture, which enables them to live in pretty close proximity to humans, to modern humans, without being detected, is they usually won't mess with stuff. It's a full understanding you're going to drag it home if you don't cause problems. But you will find the younger individuals doing this. And they can cause a lot of grief. In this case, you see a cow leg bone with a hominid bite mark in the side of it and scrape. And again, it's exactly the same scale as the previous one we showed. This would come from an individual between 10 and 11 foot probably. Grubbing logs. This is another food resource. We all understand that completely. Bears do it, and even other animals, even coyotes, will dig a log and grab for grubs. But they don't lift the bark or they lift pieces of the tree up and set them down, especially lift them up and set them down next to the other section. So there's a lot of different indicators when the Bigfoots are doing it in feeding. Of course, also is complete absence of any claw marks or anything like that, or even bite marks or chew marks, because they're doing it with their fingers. Something we've noticed in association with this, I don't know if we have a picture of it or not, but they will use not just the grubs, but they will eat the material the grub leaves behind. So you know that sawdust looking material that's inside the channels in the wood when you get done? Well, they'll pick that out and eat it as well. Probably because the cellulose has already been broken down by a previous animal that makes it digestible. Digging with sticks. So this row comes up under tool use and method. Okay, so we always assume that, well, they just run around, they're big monkeys and they do whatever, and that's not true. So tool use is really prevalent. Of course, crows use tools, and all types of primates use tools, and this has been shown. So a raven will use a stick to get something out of the ground or whatever. Even drop rocks in a bottle to raise the amount of liquid in the bottle so it can drink. That's pretty intelligent. So what would we expect of something that potentially could be one of our ancestors or a possible cousin? In this case, we see where the stick is still laying there they did the digging with. And there was tracks from 2 subjects here. And they're both known subjects to us. We have prints from them on the table because we studied this family unit for about 6 years solid. And was in with them hundreds of times during that 6-year period. So this was one of their zones that they would move in and out and do this with. So no other animal is going to physically pick up a stick and use it to dig. And there's a big difference between digging with a stick and an animal digging with its claws. You won't find linear marks spaced evenly throughout the entire structure. An animal will dig this way, this way, this way, this way, straight up and down. And so this type of digging, and then as well, you have, of course, Bigfoot feet print leading up to the event, leading away from the event. Another method is rocks for small game. Now, when we go into these bosky regions and we're in places where we know there's no people and there's no one else in there, we've been in there, we're the only ones. And I mean by that was you couldn't get in without leaving some kind of mark or sign, and no human beings are leaving any sign. We often find rocks on top of the recent forest debris. So in this case, Russian olive leaves, grass, and other things, and the rock will be sitting on top of it. Sometimes we'll go through, and the next morning when we come out, there's a rock laying there. Sometimes we'll walk through, of course, and come out, and there'll be a tree laying across the trail where we just came. Rocks for large game. This was collected when we got the 170 prints, the hair, this cast that's on the end. This large subject we assume was old because his teeth imprint were missing teeth, And the hair we got was 7 inches long and gray. And as well, he was using 2 smaller subjects to run a deer down or walk a deer down the mountain until they got to him, and he was on all 4s. We got his handprints around 3 and had this rock. And this rock weighs about 80 pounds, and it's granite, and it's wedge-shaped. And he apparently had thrown it from his position to where the deer was, because you could see where the deer tracks came down, made a little turn in front of a bush, and then the bush was totally flattened out. The rock was laying there, and there was no more deer prints. And we searched about 150 feet away from this full circle with 4 people and never found where this rock came from. So it got brought, carried into that location, apparently for that purpose. So now we'll move on to tracks. These are the ones where you guys are going to probably want to see some pretty good pictures later. But on the right-hand side here, I'm actually showing handprints and feet prints. And what you think, and I guess a lot of people think, or possibly, is that a hand looks like my hand, that my foot looks like my foot. And it does if I plant it that way. But if I plant my foot or my hand, doesn't matter. Let's say I do it like this. If you look at that, we can all look at the form it makes. And it makes kind of a paisley looking form with a twist on the end. Well, if you see that in sand, what are you, or anything else, what are you going to think? You're not going to think that's a foot, because we're programmed to see a whole track when we look at the ground. They seldom plant their whole stuff when they're ground. They move on every bit of their surfaces. It's pretty amazing too that they don't want to leave sign. They can cross stuff and not leave sign. And then a true tracker Bigfoot will go and say, hey, wait a second. What are these little divots? What are these little sweeps and things like that? They're running around with their fingertips, on their toe tips, on the edge of their foot, and moving like that. So oftentimes you'll see where they're in mud or something, and they'll step on the sides of their feet. So I'm trying not to get all into it. And speaking of that, we have tracks here where they never would have gotten them. I hardly ever see the tracks of the adults in this location. And he probably never would have, but one of the younger ones had run out of a thicket of thorns and stuff out into the riverbed. And he apparently had intersected him and taken 2 steps out and grabbed him up, just snatched him, because his prints just ended. They went nowhere, and snatched him up. And then when he turned around, made a big displacement, and stepped right back in his own track and went back out. And that's why we have a track over a track sitting here. So one was in, one was out. But you could tell that he made his least amount of mark as he possibly could as he was doing that maneuver to get back to juvenile. Knuckles and fists, you guys can't see this. So on the left-hand photo here, the small one is a set of 7-inch wide knuckle prints, and they're spaced about 4 feet, I believe, if I look at the tape there. So this is the female of this group. So that's how she stands, and her fists are countered about 15 degrees to each other. So you can imagine her on all 4s on her fists, and her hands like 7.5 inches, what her across the top of her knuckles measure. Adult hand. So this hand is 16 inches long, 15 inches wide open, and my hand is 8 inches wide, fit with my fingers out, fits exactly in the width of its palm. I can see the idea of the scale. This is tracks, of course, you're not just going to, if it's a living creature and it's out there and they're really going around, they have kids and they have all this stuff happening, you're not just going to find people. What do kids do? Kids roll around like little apes, like, right? Well, what do you think these guys are going to roll around? This is the marks from a juvenile on his knees and his hands, sliding across the sand with his knees and his hands. And he actually defecates, poops a little in the tracks. And then something comes along and picks him again. He's about 6-7 feet out of the sand. And then he can reach all the way out and just pick him out of the sand. And she only left one edge of the footprint doing that. Everything else was hard packed. It was all, gravelly bottom cemented together. So this is an infant. We have his tracks when he was a little older over here on the table. But at this point, it was 4 1/4 inches. And this is the first time we saw this subject be set down by the mother where we could find any marks of it. We had found scat that was blue because of the lactating mother and the coated milk, so it makes the scat blue or green color just like a human baby. We found that at the time, about the time the infant would have been born, shortly after that. But these prints were, they were probably 6 or 8 months later, maybe even a little bit longer, and sitting fairly about the feet were about 4 1/4 inches at that time. Toddler, 6 inch or so you're talking basically the equivalent of a 2-year-old, something like that maybe. This was one that we encountered after we recorded a male killing a dog, and then we went down there to examine, because we set up big sound recording equipment, 36-inch dishes, and catch a human voice or discussion of 2 miles. And with this, we would actually track them. We knew where the riverbed system was, so we were about a mile off the riverbed, and we could hit them on the riverbed and track them along the riverbed, and then we could tell how fast their progression is and what the male was doing and the family was doing. And at one point, he had come in to the family group, apparently because there was newborn dogs rousted him. We tore a dog apart, and then we went down there to examine the area the next day. We didn't find much from the event other than a lot of stuff busted up, not much prints. It's all hardback, but we did find the juvenile prints, or a young toddler's prints leading out in the sand. And these are almost comical because when you get a good look at these, the big toe structure makes up almost 30 to 40% of the foot when they're at this size. Their toe's huge for their size. And then it doesn't grow as fast as the rest of the foot relative to that height. So juvenile 8-inch standard. This is juvenile 9-inch. That print is on the table right here. This is one that we finally named George, and we watched him grow up till his foot's now 14 to 15 inches. Here's a track an adolescent at 10. These are young, 9 and 11. So this is actually who we call George and Amos. And we've given them the names not because that's their names. That's just how we designate the subject from subject. Adolescent at 14 inches, and this is one of the subjects in the family group. There's about 7 in the family group. This one's larger, at this time, larger than George, and we don't know what happens to him after they get so big. After about 17 inches, you don't see him down there with the family much anymore. So here's one at 17, and on the left side is a track of my boot print, and above it is its foot. You can see, if you can see that it dwarfs my foot in the footprint. Now this picture, Tara and I would planted a camera up at an event where people had, these aren't Bigfooters, these are just people that saw something huge on all fours, looked like a big monkey with yellowish colored hair, come down to the road, stand up, go back on all fours, and bolt across the road and off the bottom. And then guy in the highway department says, hey man, we're missing deer down there all the time. Deer that get hit on that pass, we take them down and toss them down off the road right there because it's got a steep drop. And so basically, each deer that gets hit, they've been throwing it over the side, and 17-inch subject has been apparently getting those from that area, and this is where he crossed. So we went and set up game cams on that. We hit it so well I had a hard time finding the camera, and all we got on it was activity, and this is when we didn't go next to the highway, we actually went in quite a ways, and where these tracks ended up being found. And the only thing we got was something was throwing snowballs into the frame of the camera. And it happened like 3:30 in the morning. It only happened a couple times. There's a bunch of triggers on the camera, but nothing in the frame. And so, but at two frames, or 2 times, and the camera triggers, then you just see snow fly into the frame. And that's it. So he's activating the IR, and he's looking, I think that might have been a 850 nanometer IR. So the lower the nanometer IR, the easier it is for a hominid or for a primate to see the light. So upwards around 940, it becomes very invisible. This camera wasn't that high. You could see a little bit of glow, and I'm sure you could see a lot more glow. And it triggered that glow at one point in time, just wouldn't get into it. But he was throwing snow into it. So here's tracks of the alpha female. So this, we've studied her a lot. So we have photographs of her. We've scaled her using survey techniques. We've been on her prints, on her scat. We've been feet behind her, her breathing, her snoring. These tracks are 20 inches long. That's a considerable size animal. She's scaled. I thought she was around 9 foot when we first took pictures and gave an estimate. And then we used survey techniques and scaled her off everything around her. She ended up being 10 foot, slightly hunched. That's massive. She was 44 inches across the hips. Now, granted, she's not near as wide as the big males are. The big males are like football players. They're huge. They really are. And but she didn't look that way. She had the classic Venus body type in a sense, where she had large buttocks, large thighs, narrower shoulders. And at that time, well, I have pictures in the computer. I won't be able to get to them now. Maybe later this evening when it's dark, I'll try to pop those out for you guys after everything's finished. It'll be a little time. But she's carrying George, which is in the photo. So I saw her from a mile away, down, right close to the water. But I had elevation on her, the river bottom. And as soon as I started taking pictures from that range, she picked up George and took off. And I was looking at her through a 70mm zoom lens, because from my eye up here, it's just a black dot. But there shouldn't be any black dots in the river bottom, period. And she's dissimilar, of course, than everything else out there. So what we do is use high-end photography, and then we're getting a lot of echo. Hello? Okay, so we use pretty high-end photography, and when we enhance those things and brought them in, we also apply what's called a vector scope, which uses certain frequencies of light, and you compare it to all the other stuff. And she can, just her, have a different frequency of light than everything else in the entire frame. You can separate her from everything else. And in these photos, they're good enough to see that she had George in her arms. And he was every bit of 6.5, 7 foot at that time. It was about 12 to 13 inch, and she still picked him up like a toddler and carried him off. And she did it at almost a mile. So that tells you how shy and reactive they can be, and why they're hard to find, hard to see. And how she even knew we were up there and spotted us cresting, it's pretty obvious. But that distance, and there's an animal, it's like the only thing I can think of, that'll spot you at that distance and take off if it wants to. They don't know what you are. The alpha male. Now this is the one, we don't have his feet. They're bigger than this one. I didn't have casting material when I ran into it. But it was 6 years before we found the first mark of it. And then it was years after that when I actually got to see the large prints, which were 23 inch. And let me have one. These are his though, and the print on the right is the 23 inch print. And it's odd because the toes are almost as wide, the big toe is as big as my heel. So that gives you the size of scale of what you look at. So when you see these tracks, your brain doesn't even put them together, it parts them out. Oh, that's a divot here, a divot there. Your brain doesn't even want to put it together unless you can catch that shine, and the trackers know what I'm talking about. As you look at the sun or whatever, you can see leaf mattering, or you can see shine from whoever took a step. Unless you get that at 30 feet, when you're on top of them, you walk right over these. You don't even realize, my brain didn't even realize. I didn't spot the first set. My buddy did, and I was almost standing on it. This one, though, this print was taken less than 3 minutes after it was made, and while the subject was still 40 feet from me. The one on the left is when the first picture, the only ones we had any indication of, and the step gaps in between those, there's a 7-foot measuring stick there. And the first step's 8 feet. The second step's around 9, and the next step to get out of the river bottom was over 12. And everything was frozen solid. This is about 4-inch thick ice. And he just punched right through it in every single step and cleared that last of the frozen bank and left no more sign. Okay, so foliage manipulation. And you guys might have to keep, I don't have my watch on me, you guys might have to keep the time and keep me out from that. So foliage manipulation is something they do for all types of reasons. And it's one of the easiest ways to track them once you know what you're looking at, what they do and where they do it. It's not hard to find if they're in an area. This is what they'll do. So they build structures. Purpose is totally up to debate unless someone actually sees them, what the purpose would be. But they look like shelters, but they're not big enough for them. They're not big enough for the big ones. So we assume that they're stuffing kids in them. At least from my point of view. But I've also found that the size is about the biggest thing you can fit in is a wild turkey. Now, I don't know why they're doing that. And this is one case of that. So on the right-hand side, there's a young man sitting in what is a human size. I could easily camp in this thing if I wanted to. And then on the left was another one that, like I said, when it was together, you may have only held turkey-sized animal creature. So it's pretty strange. Sunshades, they'll take foliage and drag them off into ravines and things like that if there's nowhere else good to get shade or if they're too hot. Breaks and twists, this is what we use as indicators to follow them in the field. And they'll take specific types of trees and twist them up. And they'll do it in a way that nothing else can. They'll do things that you or I can only dream of when it comes to section breaking. In other words, where you have to break a tree by immense pressure on 2 points very close together to get a clean snap. They cannot just do it to a set of 1-inch sapling. They can do it to a 3-inch tree where it won't split. They'll just snap it clean and it'll be totally green tree. Now, you guys, most everybody here has probably encountered firewood, encountered trees, and understands the durability. And if you break a green tree, how the splintering occurs and all this. They'll make clean breaks and stuff like that, all left and right. In this case, what we see, we call these signposts, where they'll twist a fibrous tree, whether it be cedar or something else like that, and they'll repetitively twist it almost to death, and they'll rub on it. And this is where we get most of our hair samples from, because it'll just grab the hair. We've gone back 5 years later on the same post, and it's still got the same hair in it. But you'll see where they rub their skin and everything else, and it'll smell like mom. It'll smell like whoever did it. On the left is a sectional break, and we call these daytime breaks or day breaks. Where they're occupying at the time, where the family unit is actually at maybe a quarter of a mile or a half mile stretch, and they're kind of dispersed in there a little bit loosely or whatever. But when they go to these areas, they'll do these snaps like this, the entry and exit points in these areas that are like thick foliage. And they'll do it each day they're in there. And so you can go to these entry points and look at the breaks, and if they're still wet, and they're that day, you know that they're in that area at that time. The reason they're doing it, we assume, is so that the other subjects that are transient going in and out from the group, be it the adolescents and the older teenagers and the adults, they can easily find where that group is at that time. They can just track them right back down. Rub and set posts, we kind of already went over this a little bit. And I want to say about these, though, when we find them, they're predictable. So I never found one. I mean, it took like 8 years. And then I found one. And then I went to the same kind of spot in another place, found another one. Then we went to Michigan, 1,550 miles from where we researched, found another one. And so it became predictable after a while where they're going to put them. And they put them at these corridors before they get into a thick foliage zone of one type or another tree. They'll take the little trees out front, something dissimilar, usually fibers as they can find it, and they'll snap it off and create a rub right there. And it's just like a signpost in front. And often it doesn't mark exactly where you go in, but they'll do this seasonally almost, or do it every couple of weeks or whatever when they're in an area. Blinds and barriers and blinds. So they construct barriers and blinds. And they'll do it out of some massive stuff. They'll build a barrier out of 60, 70-foot trees just to hide behind. A 70-foot tree weigh anywhere 2,500, 3,000 pounds. We've witnessed, I may show some, where they've utilized trees that are over 100 foot tall and over 31 inches thick at the base. And a tree that size will weigh 18,000 pounds. And where they've ripped them out of the ground, carried them into places, and set them down and stacked them up to make an area that can't be traveled through by deer or other creatures. And then it's just a total ambush zone. They can still move through this stuff, and almost nothing else can. This picture of foliage manipulation is for territorial prowess. And the reason I say that is, this is one picture where, on the left hand of the small photo, and you guys will realize this too, is a pine tree, about 30 foot. And it was ripped out, straight out like a carrot. And the entire taproot is on the pine tree, and now it's set sideways, where it still had all the needles and everything when it was done. And it was just set and propped in between two other trees sideways to make kind of a fence. But to do this simple little deal, hey, I just want to stack up a little fence here. This thing actually took out a 30-foot tree and just ripped it straight out of the ground. Now, how many of you have ever seen a pine tree down with its full taproot on the tree? Ever, anywhere. Now, if a bank collapses and you have a soft dirt slough and fall, you may end up with a tree hanging out of that with a taproot on it. But other than that, that root's going to snap off. It's not going to stay there. And if the tree's dead, that's one of the first things to rot out. It's right below the root zone. That you can shake the trees when they're dead because the taproot's already gone. This was fully intact and green when he pulled it out. That takes immense. The amount of strength it would take just to extract a tree like that without breaking the root is tremendous, especially when it has a curve in it where it had been growing around a rock or other obstruction. The trees on the right are in the form of an X, and this is a territorial marker or a station marker. And this was on the edge of a hunting zone. We went up into this area just to see this gigantic stuff. And there's another whole story about the lodge, and you guys can look that up, look into that. That's another big story about something we found up here that I wanted to go refine. But This is an example of how big they'll make a simple territorial X with. One tree is about 90 foot, the other tree is 80 foot. So these trees are in the well over 4,000 to 5,000 pounds, and they've stood them up and put them into a perfect X in the forest. Defecation. This is probably I'd say it's a shitty thing to study, but it's probably the most definitive as to what they do, who they are, where they go. Now, everyone likes to have all these big mythical fantasies about what these things are, and I'm going to tell you, they're real, and they're so real they don't take any of this woo or any of the paranormal stuff to explain anything they really do. But one of the best indicators, as I said, is scat material. And placement of this material is a big deal. So where is it going? So hardly any other researchers out there in the world find scat. If they ever do, it's never on a repeated basis. But once you learn where they go and how they prefer to go, then it becomes predictable. Now, we went in on this group of 7 on purpose one day to do a scat sampling and found 48 piles in one day. And it represented about 5 days of defecation for 7 individuals. But it would have been about 60 or more pounds of scat material. You know how many coyotes it would take to produce 60 pounds of scat material in 5 days? It's an awful lot. What we discovered was that they were doing it in groups. So the whole family would go together, and then they would have a subject 20 feet away, apparently maybe watching, and then he would go. Or he just doesn't like to poop right next to the rest of the family. I don't know, maybe he's shy. But that's the way they were doing it, over and over and over. And they were doing it in water courses or behind thick foliage or guarded areas up against bluffs and stuff, somewhere you're never just going to walk upon them. Interpretation of what's in the scat material, again, is the most definitive trait. This single scat material had a grasshopper leg, deer fur, rodent bone, pinyon pine nut, and Russian olive seed, all in one scat. Now that tells you a little story about what he did that day before he had that defecation. But one of the biggest things it shows us is the pine nuts in this case are 5 or 7 miles, depending on which way you go, 5 to 7 miles away from where the Russian olive are. So this subject had traveled 5 to 7 miles just during this period of consumption in between defecation periods. So it tells you what they're doing, where they're going. Plus he's picking up, you got deer somewhere, you got deer fur, you got a rodent, you got grasshoppers even. So one of the unique things, and I don't know if we're set up, I doubt we're set up for audio in this rig, or how to run it. Yeah, I don't think we are. So these were for another presentation. We're probably going to have to go by them. I'm sorry, but they're recorded vocalizations. If we get time after Chuot and we can hook up the audio with these guys, I'll blast these things out for us. Oh, these neighbors could go, oh my gosh, what that was. So foraging, this is in the behavior now. So food. They'll move as a scatter group searching as an individual for food resources. So in other words, they'll spread out in a zone 40, 50, 100 foot apart, maybe even more, and they'll pick through what they've got, and they'll just kind of go through like turkeys do. If you ever watch turkeys in the field, they'll spread out and move through the field together, picking what they can pick. They'll gather and collect food and search without collection. So without picking in, they'll just eat as they go, and as a solitary subject and things like that. They'll collect and deliver food to subjects at camp. Now this is a trait that not a lot of animals do, but cats do it, and some others. If you have an elderly cat, the younger cat will actually bring it food to eat if it loses the ability. We've seen the same thing with them. The subject that was on the table here had yucca fruit, which comes from 4,000 feet below. This was up at 10,000 foot, so the yucca's down there 4,000 foot below. It was the highest one, and they're bringing yucca. Someone's bringing yucca fruit up, and he's biting it, consuming parts of it, but leaving these bite imprints as an individual that's missing a lot of teeth. And our assumption, we never found any of his prints going down the mountain all the way, so our assumption was from that other subjects were bringing him that stuff up from the valley floor. So using top methods, plant animal hatch and migration. So what we have here is where you're learning, you can learn in two ways. You can learn through observation, or you can learn through instruction. And what we're finding, most of this would have to be learned through instruction to understand these things. It's like when the hatchings of the gypsy moths are, and which mountain slopes that they'll hatch out on. So you'll find you'll find the northern slopes is where, in the sunny zones on the northern slopes is where the gypsy moth grubs will all be. And they go up there and flip 1,000-pound rocks and dig these things out. But you never see the flipping of the rocks or any of the activity until it's right at that point, right before the hatch outs happen. So what it indicates is, why aren't you up there doing it at any other time? And how in the heck do you know to go up there during the hatching and get all these things out of the ground? That's not the only one. There's a lot of food acquisition stuff that we see that would most likely take instruction. So you have an older individual, or you have witnessing through food acquisition when this is. And then it's pretty tough to teach somebody when the moths are going to hatch and things like that. So they search as an individual subject for food, and they will do that. So when they get up into their older years, like I said, maybe a foot, 15, 18, 20 inch, they can be quite cantankerous about visiting farms for food and things like that. We believe that they're not as skilled as food acquisition as some of the other subjects. So they'll bop in and hit farms and hit different regional stuff and do a lot of food acquisition as solitary without having anyone else around them. They're not going to bring it to anybody else. So this takes us to hunting. They use cooperative hunting techniques for small and large game. We've kind of gone over that a little bit. They'll funnel and direct gear into ambush positions. So we've seen a lot where they'll run, there'll be a spot where maybe an arroyo drops down into a larger canyon, and you can't see the only way to go down through that funnel, and they'll work them on both sides of the hill down there real slow, and then the subject will wait down there at the ambush point to snatch them. And when I was with that big male that left that 23-inch print, I kept trying to go around this little corner, and every time I did, one would go to that point with me. And we call those a pinch point. And so past the pinch point, you're going to get snatched. And that's kind of over and over. Any other animal would move away from the pinch point as you approach it. And these were not doing that. They were moving toward that pinch point with me. And that's enough to really, really get your goat, I'll tell you that. The funnel and direct gear activity is presence of vocal reports. So they'll make noises, stepping, and reveal themselves to animals without spooking them all the way off. Or they'll do these little whoop, whoop, and do stuff like that. And they'll key the animal and get them a little edgy so they're not just standing there. And then they'll kind of funnel them that way. So they don't want them to run. And we've witnessed them being very, very crafty about doing it subtly. But they want to keep them moving because they want to get one. So, construct, utilize sound traps, locate prey and danger. This is something that's pretty crafty, and we've seen it a bunch of times. And they'll do it in different forms. So if they're in a thick zone or area where you got your family all hidden in there, they'll only be a couple of ways in or a couple of ways out. And they'll block those, even if it's temporary. And they'll leave in one way in, one way out. And then they'll leave a back door. And often on the way that would be the front door, they'll lay down the branches and make a crosshatch and then fill it full of leaves. And it'll be big enough to where I can't step over it, but the big ones can. And so anything that walks down that trail is going to step in that and make noise. We call them sound traps. And we hate them because they catch us. We won't have a way around them. The stuff will be so thick, our only way of progression will be through this. And you can't even pick the branches up without making noise. So we reveal ourselves. And oftentimes after we hit those sound traps, then you'll get one vocal report. Like this. And then we know, well, we're busted. So they got us. They know where we're at. They know we're in here. Build rodent and small game traps, fashion as nests and things. So we've seen this, and this is all we can glean from this, what's going on. They'll take a stump, natural or cut, into an open area, and they'll place the stump to where the root side down, and they'll stuff grass underneath it. Now this is, rats and stuff grass. But it's a whole different deal when you have a clump tore off and laid in there as a clump. And we have seen where we've come back later and laid these things over, and you can see where rodents have nested in them. And then we've come back and seen them turned over. And so all we can assume when we witness that is something's making a trap. It's making an area that a rodent will go nest in. So later it's an opportunistic thing. They can check that, get something to munch. Occupation. Utilize an area for 2 square miles, 5 to 7 day period as a family group. This is what we found to be average. and river bottoms such as what we have in this valley. Utilizing over range approximately 100 square miles as a family group. So generally, once they're in a spot, they'll occupy it for a point in time, then they'll devour the resources, and then they'll move on to another zone, might be several miles down the river, whatever, and it'll generally be about 100 square miles, 10 by 10 miles area overall that they're gaining all the resources and their movement activity. They'll change, as I said, they'll change the areas as the impact grows. So as they scare the game, they deplete the resources, they'll often just bolt from that spot completely and just relocate 4 or 5 miles down the river zone or whatever, so they can, somewhere there's fresh going on. The overall range due to seasonal migration, things like that. So what we have here is it's greatly varies. People say, well, do they migrate? Some do migrate. What's their range? It's much greater in some areas than it is others, and it's almost always around resource acquisition or seasonal changes in maybe a family unit. So it's based on need, and it changes everywhere there are. So it's like humans in the sense that there's no thing one group of humans do. Some humans do migrate. They migrate with herds of reindeer, things like that. Others are extremely sedentary, where you have generations never leave the same valley, and that's what we see to be true. They utilize high rugged areas as retreats for solitary group of large males. Now this is really interesting, because it apparently, in the group we studied for 6 years, that large male was hardly ever in there. And he did vocal reports when he came in, which may not be for several months period. Often it was every couple of weeks, especially when you would have young in there with him. He was coming in more often. But what we found was, when you go into the highest and the biggest and the most rugged areas, you have signs of the largest, biggest individuals, and you have activity that we would assume goes to male activity, because they do obviously have a different order. They do have that set boundary, and it seems like that at a certain age, certain size, it seems like the big males just don't want to mess with everything anymore. They just want to go do their own thing, and then come down and visit the family once in a while, and they'll get together. And so what we see in these big areas where I showed you the massive stuff, that's one of these zones, and these zones are considered very dangerous. On that particular trail, I'm not blowing anybody here, up to 30 people have gone missing in a single year with no criminal investigation. One of our team members who went up there with me on that trip is U.S. Forest Service, 35 years, 19-year officer, still active, still manager in the U.S. Forest Service today. He was there with me. He looked up the information to verify that information. He said that he found 37 people in 3 years is what he had found that had gone missing on that trail. Now, they've been trying to close that trail and erase this loop for a decade now. It's not on the modern maps, and most of it's closed off or off limits. And the area we found this stuff, when it hit the news and all this other stuff, and it got into Eastern Mexico University, and it got to KOAT and the KRQEs, other local news stations, ABC, NBC, the U.S. Forest Service closed this entire area. And they did so to prevent adverse interactions between humans and rare and sensitive species. Now, when you do a closure for species, there's always a number on it for the species that seeks protection, but there wasn't. And it said to reduce the chance of adverse interaction. Now, that's not impact on a species. That's adverse interaction. That means the species have an impact on you as well. And that was as far as they went with that. And then Ron Castor, the USFS guy, he researched that stuff, and inner office could not figure out why these closures are occurring. Of course, we know why they're occurring. So grouping. How do they assemble? So the form family unit, 7+ individuals, the females in the lead until daddy comes home. Daddy's gone most of the time, and it seems like the mom is the boss. And you got because all the activities the group does as a group, it all follows around where she's going, where she's occupying. You'll never find the rest of the group off somewhere that the mother's not, unless it's the adolescents taking off at night and doing the stuff teenagers do. They'll form large subgroups of young to hunt. Forage per unit often cause trouble. And that's what we kind of say. So the adolescents will get into groups of anywhere between, it depends on how many's around. You apparently will have adolescents from different groups join together at night and go rampage around and do stuff, hoot and holler and make all kinds of ruckus. And just like in a lot of cases with Native Americans and with the U.S. Cavalry and these guys, a lot of the massacres and stuff happened as a result of what the teenage boys were doing at night. That happened more than once, where the tribe itself would be like, hey, don't mess with them. Leave them alone. The young men would go, screw that, man, let's go out tonight and go poke their horses. Often the response was to go and slaughter the tribe. So we see that same type of activity in here, where we've had mimics of a horse and mimics of a crow and all this other stuff, and then turn into primate whooping, and then you can hear how many's actually in the group. We get 8 or 10 subjects out there just screaming and going nuts and run off through the trees, like they just spooked the human, or just picked on the human, and everybody kind of gets off on it. They'll form smaller subgroups, 2 to 3 older subjects to hunt, forage for large game, and raid. So we see that too, and it's usually when they do this, it's much more choreographed and much more controlled. This is where you see the ambush predatory and things like that, or when they're raiding some place, you'll see distraction happen while they're producing and conducting a raid over here. So they'll actually distract attention so they can go grab something. Males often move a few miles away, alone, when young, but fully mature. So we'll have feet sizes 17, 18, 19 inches, and they're generally solitary. And they apparently, the males seem to have a much more robust, wider foot than the females. The females seem to have a more feminine foot until they get real big and they get a little heavy. But we see their tracks in areas where there's really no other Bigfoot sign. And it's interesting because they also will go back into the group occasionally. They'll return. And it equates to maybe, 20, 25-year-old young guy or female who is venturing out. But still coming back home every once in a while and returning to the family. And we had one subject that we followed quite frequently up on this particular mountain, Ortiz Mountain. And over the years since we started following him, his foot had grown from around 16 to around 17 and a half. And he should be the very same subject who left the 17-inch prints that we found. And he's on that mountain by himself, because you can go up there over and over and you never see sign of any other subject. And we videoed him one night descend 200 feet down the mountain in 5 seconds, jumping 30-foot leaps, and then went off about a 30, 40-foot drop straight down over to a pinon tree that was 20 inches thick or so, and then shake it 5 times and rip it out of the ground. And then go around by the root ball and duck down. So all we could assume was when he was feeding or whatever, he jerked out with the root ball. Large males often retreat to the highest, ruggedest, densest areas together. So we already covered this. That the big males don't want to be around the families. Now I want to say this too. This is also true in native tribes of modern humans. So often there's zones and places like kivas and things like that where it's only the elder males. And they will get together and do what they do. And it's without the interference or anything else from any of the rest of the tribe. Often it's to retell histories and it's to share secrets and things and important natures of the tribe or make important discussions. We don't know why they're doing it, but they apparently have the same trait or habit. So this is man versus ape. The modern view, curriculum and classification. So how does academia actually see this versus how the media tells you academia actually sees this? See, we don't get our sources from academia as humans. We wait for the media to get it from academia and then deliver it to us. But what does academia really, really think? I'm going to read this. This is from a curriculum, modern curriculum, of the book called Through the Lens of Anthropology, 2nd edition, 2019, Introduction to Human Evolution and Culture, Chapter 2, page 50. This is where they bring in Bigfoot. They've got an entire 2 pages just dedicated to Bigfoot. Why is this in modern anthropological curriculum? I thought it was just a fantasy and a myth. It absolutely cannot exist. How come they didn't mention any of the rest of the fantasy and myth and things that don't exist? These are indicators. It says that. If I can get it to work here. It says that believers should be aware that if they do cite Bigfoot, they should probably leave it alone. It probably isn't a large human-like ape. If it exists, it is probably a human who wants to be left alone. and nobody should do it harm. Recall that if a primate is bipedal, as Bigfoot is typically reported to be, it is classified as human. Now, who wants to know that? Who out there wants to wrestle that? I'm going to tell you a couple of things. I know Utah's a very patriotic state, and I know they're very concerned with their rights and preserving those rights. Well, how would you feel about all the rights you've been granted that you want to preserve so hard if you understood that there's a human out there that has more rights than you ever dreamed of? It has rights to live wherever it wants to live. It has rights to go anywhere it wants to go. But you don't know he's out there, so you don't care. You know, a man in a prison with a large open space and a big fence can feel free until he sees a man outside that fence. And that reflects to him, what else is out there in this world? What am I? How come I can't go outside this fence and look at it? Well, isn't that exactly where we stand as humanity compared to another race of humans we might be sharing our planet with? If they're out there, they can go wherever they want. They can live however they want. They're not taxed, they're not told what to do or anything else. So will you tell me what the definition of human rights is? Don't we have that right? And if they're human and they're exhibiting that right, and that right's being protected by academia and other agencies that know they exist, that aren't telling you they exist, what is that? Are we getting our human rights? What is a human right? I'll tell you right now, they don't need you to ask those questions, and they damn sure don't need an example of a group of humans living feral out there in the woods to this day. Nobody tells them where to go. Nobody tells them what to do. And they live just fine. They don't need that to happen. And you also need to ask yourself, then why in the world, other than that, why wouldn't somebody pop off it? Well, in academia, it's not worth it because you will be blacklisted, you will be shut down, the AP will lie about you, and everything else will happen. And this has happened to our foremost geneticists. This has happened to biologists and other scientists who have tried to step over this fence. Unless you're willing to say it's a big ape. If you'll say it's Gigantopithecus and it crossed the land bridge 10,000 years ago, you're in. No problem. We'll put you on TV all day long. But if you're a scientist and you say absolutely not, this is a hominid, this is a human being, but you're not going on that TV. You're not going anywhere near it. Matter of fact, you are now a nutcase who shouldn't be in science. Trying to get this to go forward if it cooperates with me. So this is what we talk about where's the proof? That's pretty interesting because the proof's been given. Why didn't you hear about it? Well, because the media hasn't told you about science and hasn't told you about true academia and the professionals, just like we just said. In this case, this is a sample number that anyone out there can call and check on. And you can put some pressure on them. This is the sample that we put into the Oxford Collateral Hominid Project that probably broke the bank for them because it had so much other supporting evidence. It was taken, trace of custody was immaculate. Everything was done in hermetic sealed cabinets, the whole 9 yards. There was no chance of contamination, all on film. They knew this, but that sample was not included in the study even though they told everyone in the world that it was. Then they wrote us and said, no, it's being curated for further study at the Museum of Zoology in Lausanne. Well, why'd they do that? And then what about this? And why hasn't it been tested? They told the world that every sample had been fully tested and qualified, but they found things like wolf, polar bear, possum, a weird polar bear, other bear hybrid that they think is the Yeti, blah, blah, blah. And I'm going to tell you, when you hear something like that, it's absolute bull. And here's why. Because every hair has to get qualified first. And even a second-year biologist in most departments can take them into their lab and identify any one of the known hairs from any animal on the planet. They've got libraries of this information. The only thing you're going to test is an unknown. You're not going to ever do an DNA test on a dog hair that shows up as a dog. Or even bear. Why would you? It's a bear. I'm not looking for that. I'm looking for collateral hominids. Okay, but they yet came back with results from a possum and a bear and a dog and all these things. That right, the whole thing is fake. The whole damn thing. Yet the samples that were sent in that did not fit any known creature that's running around out there were not talked about or not discussed about in the test. They said every single sample is from a known animal. That sample is not. And you guys are welcome to take that number, 25076, and inquire with the Museum of Zoology in Lausanne and inquire with Oxford University and ask them where the hell that sample is. And why did you lie to the Associated Press about it? Why isn't the testing included? And where is it? Because we can't find out. They've tried to bury this. Now here's the next one. I'm sorry to say this, I'm going to involve someone who's the biggest face in Bigfoot. And that's just too bad. I'm sorry to call you out, Brent. But it's just the way it is. University of New Mexico, the executive director came to us up on the reservation there and asked us to do a field study on the species. So we did. We conducted a year-long field study. Went to many locations. There's Bigfoot hair that's real. It's real Bigfoot hair on the table from the university study. This is called DNA evidence. This is a physical proof. Now, at the termination of this study, there was a very professional PhD who we involved in it to get our DNA analysis through, to take it to the appropriate domestic laboratories. And we didn't want anything to go overseas. We had a lot of material, and it was all quality. And it all came with witness events, supportive evidence being tracks, all kinds of stuff, even blood. And so we gave him this evidence and to turn on. Well, he would not recontact the executive director of UNM. He wouldn't answer the phone. This is a PhD guy's on TV for Bigfoot all the time. Every face in here that's ever seen a Bigfoot show's probably seen him. We handed it to him. So after a year, we were going to present the findings, our field study findings, to the academics, to the professors and the students as well at this university. We're going to open it to the public, invited all the Native American elders, but we were actually doing it at an academic level. What occurred was they got a hold of this professor and invited him to come speak as well. Hey man, come share the stage. And he was going to do a speech on Gigantopithecus and how it crossed the Bering Land Bridge, which is fine, whatever. But when he got there, we asked him, because he hadn't answered the phone for a year. We're looking for the analysis. We're looking for the report. And so we get him at breakfast or dinner or whatever it was, and we asked him straight up what happened to the DNA material we gave you? What happened to all the physical evidence we handed you? And he just shrugged his shoulders and kept eating. And I said, hey man, no. I said, where's the trace of custody? He said, there's no trace of custody. I said, what do you mean there's no trace of custody? There's a trace of custody on everything. There's no such thing as not giving it a number when you're going to do a sample of measurement, anything. You have to have a way to refer to what you're working on. Everything has a sample when it gets submitted, everything. Each one of those submitted pieces should have had a sample number, and even the submission itself should have been named and titled. Or how are you going to keep track of it? He said, I don't know. And I said, no, you're not going to get away with that. Who did you hand this stuff to? Where did you go? Where did you give it to? Where did it go? You didn't lose it. He said, I gave it to Brian Sykes, who was the same guy who ran the Oxford Collateral Hominid Project, who lagged to the AP, who in London, who we told him, no, it's not, and we told him verbatim, it's not to go overseas, and especially not to Brian Sykes. And that's the person he handed all to. Now you tell me, what kind of professional, academic, as a professor at a university in Idaho? That's right, Jeff, sorry, but that's true, and that's what he did. Now, I'm a nobody, so I guess he just assumes he can get away with, doing whatever he does. Nobody's going to hear about it. Who am I? And if I start crying, I'm going to sound like the jerk. But this came down to charges being filed on the executive director for committing fraud for the study because we had no proof the study was conducted. Because he did that. They tried to go after this guy for criminal charges. They go after everyone else. Then they did a special investigation news report on KRQE there in Albuquerque, New Mexico. This is a network, 22-minute show, and on it was us all over the place. On it was my crew, my team, the Native American guys that helped us, the executive director, all of them being called frauds during a special investigation. We saw the ad for this, and I drilled them. I hit them as hard as I could hit them. And they pulled our segments and our name out, but they left pictures and video of me conducting operations in the field. It's pretty amazing because as a response to that, a state senator proposed law to prevent any university monies going into what they call mythical creatures. And they said this on the basis we had no proof. Because why? All the DNA and physical evidence was handed to Mr. Meldrum. And I ask you right now, as it says, Where did they go? Because we don't have them. And I mean, people almost went to jail over this stuff. Now, it was discretionary funds we used. It cost $7,000 to do the year deal. We didn't get that. We paid everything on our part out of pocket, probably about equal to that. That money went into the showing of all this information, the discretionary funds. They could have used it for pizza. But the entire campus and college voted that they wanted to see the results of this Bigfoot stuff. And it doubled the highest showing they had for anything at that college university in 47 years. And it was the first time that the Navajo elders had ever come out of the shadows to discuss the species, in which they did. They sat down and told us all kinds of things about it. Even some of the words they speak in ancient Navajo, which was interesting because you had people who live in Fruitland there, and you live in the river bottoms, and they hear these things say this word, and I believe it was like "shiga." And then what was interesting was one of the elders sat down there and said, "We're going to explain to you what that is." You people hear them say this word, and yes, it's not a sound, it's a word. It's ancient Navajo for just passing by. So isn't that wild? Yet all that was buried and consumed. And then we had to go do a scientific presentation to a group of scientists from University of New Mexico, from Los Alamos Laboratories, Sandia Laboratories. We had their top biologists, we had astrophysicists there. Who knows, but they were there. And all of them acting as a skeptic peer review group. That's what they do. They shoot down people's bad research. Professionally. They're called the New Mexicans for Science and Reasoning. After 3 hours, not one of them questioned any of this data. Every one of them said they had all backed up. That was it. Because we laid down physical evidence, we laid down trace evidence, we laid down the entire thing with repeatable results. And they're scientists. These guys are true blue. They could not dispel what we were showing them based on a scientific principle. They had to agree. Not necessarily that it's there, but something is there that warrants scientific investigation, and it's highly likely that they missed, in his words, a large primate. One of the guys who's the top astrophysicist for the University of Mexico went to dinner with us afterwards. And he told me, Dave is the guy that ran the whole thing, and the man that they had on the news show to disprove us, this guy Dave Thomas. He told me that Dave told him that he thought we had it. And he told us, if you can change Dave, you can change anybody with your information. Then Dave asked us if he could go out in the field with us. That doesn't tell you. That was their key skeptic they used to file a law, press criminal charges, and the whole 9 yards. But in the essence, it still reflects to, why did we get in that situation? Why don't you know they're real? Why don't you know that they're listed in the Zoo Bank Genomic Library under the name Homo sapiens cognatus? See, we're Homo sapiens, but so was Neanderthal, so was Denisovan. They were all Homo sapien. They're Homo sapien neanderthalis, Homo sapien denisovan, as Homo sapien heidelbergensis. We are Homo sapien sapien. They are Homo sapien cognatus. This is our thinking relative, is what that means in Latin. Now they've been classified, accepted, and they are listed in Zubek Genomic Library. That means they exist. That means if I find a piece of DNA and I run that DNA through a full series, there is DNA in a Zubek library to compare it to show it's a Bigfoot. But they haven't told anybody here this, have they? This is where I want people to open their eyes. This is what I came here to basically produce for you today. So we're going to end this, I think I'm probably about that time, with a quote by Albert Einstein. The fairest thing we can experience is the mysterious. It is the fundamental emotion which stands at the cradle of the true art and science. But isn't that interesting? How science doesn't really like to deal with the mysterious, does it? It doesn't. What mysteries does science touch? And I gotta remind you, science is supposed to be the study of the unknown. But how come you have things that are unknown that they won't bring into science? Is that science? We're not even seeing science. We don't see that world at all. But we see the media. We see the talking heads. And we see the narrative that is most convenient to keep everybody just like it is. Don't ruffle the waters. Don't upset anything. It's all good to go. And at that, I want to say thank you for hearing my presentation this evening. And you guys are all welcome to step up here in the interim and check out the Bigfoot casts and the hair and the other stuff we've got. And then I think if there's some time later after Chuak gets his deal done, we'll probably try to bring up some of the other information. We'll take it all another level. Thank you very much.
That's one of the best presentations ever.
You bet. That's great. It was great. I had a fear I was running out of time. I'm probably out of time. So the question is, why do they do what? Why do they hide it from us? Okay, so the question is, why do the powers that be hide this information? Okay, I'll give you a quick one. California state parks, admission alone. Now, granted, when you go on a vacation to a state park, what's the cheapest thing in the whole thing? Park admission. It's cheaper than you spend on hot dog buns. But they bring in $80 million a year just in park admission. What percentage of that is what people spend on a vacation to our national parks? So let's say, I mean, my gosh, you guys, Taco Bell 3 times, you spend $100 with 2 people. What do you spend in a week in the national forest? For your groceries, and your gas, and your fuel, and all your things that you need to do that, plus your park admission. Would you say that park admission is what? 10% of that? So is $8 10? Do you go out there for a week for $80 or whatever it is? So what you have to factor is that the park admission is a very small fraction. It might be 5% maybe of what they're bringing in on park activity overall. And you're talking $80 million is only 2 to 5%. That's a single economic reason. Just that one. Just the impact on state park admissions. Because if you tell people that there's a 10-foot guy running around there that might grab your sister and might rip your camp apart or whatever, it doesn't matter what people envision, they're not going out there anymore. Here's another thing. We trust academia, don't we? But let's say they admitted they exist tomorrow. What's that mean? That means that academia has either not known about it or they've lied to you about it. Well, lying to you about it's pretty sinister. And not knowing about it after generations of tens of thousands of biologists out there, well, that's pretty incompetent now, isn't it? So can we trust people that don't know this thing's out there when it's out there and they're the pros? Now, what about the U.S. Forest Service, the Department of Interior, Department of Agriculture, BLM? Don't they all know? Right? So why don't we know? Well, here's what happens. If somebody tells a lie long enough, you can't admit it. It gets so bad that admitting it means you've been telling this lie this whole damn time. And this is where I want to give the outs to like Ron Castor, rangers, and representatives, U.S. Forest Service, and things like that, because it's not them doing it. This was the fathers of this stuff and the ideals that did this. Academia, religious, economic, there's so many reasons that they had not to share this with you. And then they've buried themselves in their own hole because they've already lied to you. And if they haven't, they're incompetent. Go on.
Oh yeah, okay. I've seen her, yeah. I'm happy to show her.
So much fun.
No, I think those are the next speakers.
So the comment was that as long as they say they don't exist, they can ignore them and keep on doing what they're doing, that they wouldn't have a seat at that table to make any discussions for reservation and things like that. And she's absolutely correct. Another thing is, would they come to that table? So what do you do with a group who won't show up for the discussion? Who just ignores you and lives out there anyway? What do you do with them? And could you put them on a reservation? Could you do that? Could you align them into society? You couldn't. And that goes back to human rights. Do they have a right to exist without us doing that to them? And then here we go again. Off goes the circle. Any other questions? Absolutely.
I don't know if your world crosses over into our missing 411 with Dave Politis, but why is it so hard for the National Park Service to release the names of all the missing people that constantly go missing in our national parks and wilderness?
Well, think about this. What's the first, I'll ask you, if that came to us, the second question would be why, wouldn't it? And what's going to be their answer? Either culpability or to say, I don't know. What agency, even scientific, wants to say, I don't know? What happens when I don't know something means I'm incompetent. I'm an idiot. When I prefer, and I say the whole time, trust me, you're safe out there, no problem. And thank you for asking that question. That brings up another aspect of that is potential liability. How many people have lost family members in the forests? Now, we have thousands and thousands missing. You guys have no idea. It's in the hundreds of thousands a year. Okay, not just national forests, that's overall people missing, but a tremendous amount of them come out of forested regions and the backcountries and things. When the agencies get caught, in a sense, that these things are out there, and you haven't told us that they're out there. My family went out there last year, and Aunt Velma vanished, and her shoes were left behind. They found her body up on the top of the cliff or something weird. Well, how many people are going to strike immediately back out and say, why in the world didn't you tell us these damn things were out there? And that they could potentially present a danger. Now, this brings me to 1974. None of this stuff was really secret. By 75, it was. With the advent of the show In Search Of and things like that being put on. Now, this is one of the shows that brought me into it. But when the show was put on, it was immediately presented as a myth, as a mystery. Yeah, in 1974, Bigfoot was included in the species list in the Olympic Forest and other places in the Pacific Northwest for military training as to the species you were likely to encounter. They had orca, they had bear, they had all kinds of things, and on there they also had Bigfoot. Well, why would it be included? And why in 74 was it okay? You'll also see that there's FBI studies into Bigfoot hair and things in the early 70s. So it was being studied and announced and actually being accepted right up into a certain year point. That's 1975. Now, politically, anyone could probably look back and see the political changes, academic changes, and things like that that probably led to that time frame being when they did this, but they sure did. Okay, any other questions? Absolutely. Any evidence of it? No, I sure don't. But here's what we have heard is intergroup communication over many, many miles distance. So when a large male howls, you can hear that 10 to 20 miles from one mountaintop to another. And I know because we record them off a mountain that'll be 10 to 15 miles in distance. And in those type of situations, we have heard as also aggressive vocalizations. Now, whether or not they've ever met up in the forest and had the throwdown or not, I don't know. Most big animals avoid conflict because it usually can result in one or the other end up dead. Either from that moment or a recorded injury that lapses them. So. Yeah, so he just mentioned that the primates in Africa often conduct warfare, and that's true. And it's also funny that some do and some don't. And I think regionally a lot of that is compression of resource. The chimps are much more, I would say, affected by the compression of those resources than a Bigfoot would be, because they can literally move their family unit 150, 200 miles away, and in a night or two, if they have to do that, and retreat to country that no one else can get to, where chimps and gorillas and things are very regionally compacted, and they're not built for that type of travel. So. Well, what was just quoted was that in here in Uinta Basin there was two different groups of Bigfoots, and that the natives had recorded that at one time or another one of the groups started to consume the offspring of the other group, which led to a conflict. And you're asking me, and that question is why something like that would occur. Well, as a species, I consider them mostly all one thing. So when we look at people today, depending on where we draw those lines, a lot of people are very different. So people can eat things that can kill other people. So I believe that Homo sapiens cognatus is one species of human. But within that, they're intertribal. and regional aspects to them. So there is differences, just like there is in people. Based on, where people come from around the world, we have a lot of racial traits, right? We have different skin color, different eyes, different everything else, and they seem to be very much represented the same way. So it's more like fighting between clans, in a sense. And I can certainly see where some do and some don't, because in a lot of regions, they're very docile, almost playful. And New Mexico is one of the places that's known for things highly aggressive encounters. We've responded to stuff where on the res there we were told about how a horse was ripped in half in a corral. A cow had both of its front legs ripped off and was stuffed head first in a culvert. And these are messages to the human occupants there. So you can assume that if two Bigfoot groups overstepped a boundary, depleted a resource, one of their subjects went rogue and maybe killed another one, or even that they got into consuming each other, that would be a trait that just like anybody else. And you brought up something that reminds me. So wolves, there was a group of wolves one time that went rogue and were killing pups amongst this one pack. And alpha males from 3 or 4 different packs got together and went and killed those rogues, and to preserve that. So that's pretty interesting. We talked about, like you just mentioned, how would they be in that nature? And what we found is if they react like humans. They really, really do. You're going to eat my kids, I'm going to put all hell down on you. And that's what it seems to be. Any other questions? Absolutely, go ahead.
I was just wondering, have you ever observed human-like emotion, laughing, crying, or possibly burial ritual?
So absolutely on the emotion thing, full gamut. We've heard a mother laughing with its infant. In fact, when we did their videos are called the MJ13. That was the study we did for UNM. Earlier in the day, I had found scat from an infant, and I found scat from another smaller subject on the side of the river. Apparently, when they'd stuck them while they did something. And I told the group, man, I think they got a baby out here. And later, about 10 o'clock that night, this is very human. I hate to say this, but you hear a laugh of what sounds like an adolescent girl, a little chuckle, at first you hear an infant just laughing, like giggling, like a little bitty. When you get an infant to cackle and giggle, you hear that coming out of the brush, and then you heard a young female sounding laugh at it, like it was laughing at it. And there was, of course, it stopped everybody in their tracks. And I was with this was J.C. Johnson and Jack Carey, and you may have seen those guys on TV and stuff. And these are the big wigs, and they, everybody tripped. I gotta say, because out of this tremendous, it's at the San Juan River. It's a lot like the river systems here, 30 feet wide, a few feet deep, lots of Russian olive, and out in the middle of this thicket comes a baby, chud giggling, and the female laughing with it in response. And to me, that was probably the core of what the human experience would be in that moment. And it was so expressive of it. As well, the protective nature, am I good? As well, the protective nature, there was, and it's on video, the MJ13 as well, there was a very large subject and a smaller subject, and I turned, and without aggression really, I turned and I made the comment to the video that I'll go check out the smaller subject. And as soon as I said that, I went toward that, I got grunted at. And it was boom. And just like that second part of that grunt, the second part was like I got hit in the ribs with a rolled up piece of carpet. If you can imagine an 8-foot chunk of carpet, you roll it up and slam somebody, that's what that hit felt like. But I didn't sense any aggression at all. And that was interesting to me because that, again, is a very human thing. It was a very decisive moment of, hey man, you can do whatever you want, but you don't mess with a kid. And then right back to being cool again, because I went away from that. So I hope that answers your question to some degree. Okay, we got time for one or two more, and that's it. Has the body ever been found? Publicly released? No. Yeah, absolutely, the agencies have recovered bodies, without a question. Are we going to hear about it anytime soon? Probably not. But both alive and dead. And I say alive because I know of the executive director told me about a small one that was left there on the res by the female. The female never came back. So they brought in the Department of Natural Resources and they came and collected him up. So that's one.
So what about these elongated skulls from Peru with the red hair? Could these possibly already be evidence of Bigfoot that we already have?
So I'm asked if the Baraka skulls in Peru, the ones that had the cone heads and the red hair, could be any evidence of the Bigfoot stuff. And I'll just say pretty blatantly, no, I don't believe so. The Baracas were actually classified in the late 1800s as Homo capensis. So now they seem to be off the charts. But if you go look the stuff back up, it was a type of human that was being described in the early 1900s. Now they seem to be wiped off the map. And no, I don't believe so. I don't believe they have anything to do with the Nephilim or any of this other stuff. They just don't need to be. It's the Homo capensis, I think, were of an, if anything was of the Nephilim line or any other thing like that, genetic manipulation, I believe Homo capensis would have been our closest representative of that. Okay, I guess we're going to wrap it up right there. Thank you guys again.